Welcome back, you lovely marvels. How in the heck are you today? Hi, Dina. We're back for another episode.
Hey, Gwen, we're back today. We are.
We are. And today, we want to talk about this very loaded word, IQ or intelligence.
Yeah.
Because it comes up a lot.
Mhm.
And as psychologists, licensed psychologists, it's part of our wheelhouse to be able to diagnose and assess. And oftentimes, all of us actually that have gone through a doctoral level training in psychology are trained to assess for cognition. We used to call it intelligence, but I guess this is the conversation we're going to have today, which is why all the heat with the word intelligence?
Well, I think that people really don't know. The first thing I remember learning, and that we teach in cognitive assessment or IQ, if we're teaching the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and then there's kid versions, is what is intelligence? And it really, for psychologists doing testing, intelligence is really defined by the tests they're using, because different tests assess for different parts of, like you said, cognition, or what the authors of the test, sort of, I'm doing the air quotes for those of you that are listening, what they define as intelligence. And kind of the classic one of people will just say, oh, what's your IQ? And so for the lay audience, what is IQ? What is like your number, right? So I always been like, well, okay, so first of all, which test are we talking about? Because the number that you get is going to be different on something like the Wechsler or the Stanford Binet. Those numbers mean something different. And then what a lot of people don't know, unless they've been through testing themselves, is there's all kinds of testing that we do, like in an intelligence test. So something like the WAIS has a whole bunch of subtests, and it has two sides to it. It's what we call performance IQ and then verbal IQ. And by verbal, we mean like we ask you questions about things you've learned in school, or ask you to solve math problems, or ask you about vocabulary kinds of things. Those are all what we call deemed verbal. And those kinds of things, trying to figure those things out. And those used to be called nonverbal, but now they're called performance. So you have all these, I believe I'm correct still, that there's at least 10 on each side. So these tests take a long time to administer. And if you've been through, like, for example, neuropsych testing, and you got a report from those, that's nice because you can tell different things from each of those subscales. And then you can tell other things like processing speed, and do they tend to be strategic in their thinking, and does their ability to do things, is it affected by anxiety? So there are certain tests that are really sensitive to that, like doing math in your head and stuff like that. So there's things beyond just that one big, what we call full scale IQ number. There's performance, there's verbal, and then there's all those subtests that try to get at different constructs of intelligence, again, air quotes. So things like, what did you learn in school? Does someone have a big depth and breadth of vocabulary? Do they have a lot of words that they know? And when you ask them what that word means, do they give you a rich answer? Or do they give you a kind of surface, one-dimensional answer? And then all those things, and why we have to get trained in it, is those kinds of answers we have to assign numbers to based on how we learn. Like, is this a really deep answer? Is this a superficial answer? Is this answer just wrong? Did we say, what is a bottle? And you said, well, it's like something you put water in and carry, like they give you a definition of a bucket, which wouldn't be a bottle, right? So there can be wrong answers. And then you add all these points up, and it gives you a lot of this information. And the newer version can give you things like working memory index, processing speed, instant and then delayed recall. And there's a lot of other things that this test tends to build in each time it's revised, which is nice because you can get more information from it. And so a neuropsychologist and someone who's using an intelligence or cognitive assessment, because we're trained in this, a lot of times they don't even tell the client like their number, their full scale IQ. Or when I've done it and I've given feedback, if I give them that, we go through a whole session or two giving feedback on the test, because I don't want you to just know your overall number. I want you to know like where your strengths are, where your growth areas are, where are areas that you might need a lot of support because you didn't do well on the test. And the idea is we want to get an assessment of how you think and how you problem solve and how you sort of do those tasks. That's what we mean by intelligence, right? That said, one of the other first things you learn when you're learning about any assessment, whether it's projective or cognitive or personality testing, is sort of the evil history of these tests, right? I mean, one is kind of the eugenics movement and all this terrible history about, not too long ago, people of color aren't as smart because they don't do well on these tests. Well, the tests were developed and normed on white college kids. So if you didn't belong to that demographic, it's just not going to test you well. And the great example I always give my students is my wife was a third grade teacher in a very, very small town in Montana for several years. And she remembers what we call standardized tests, asking questions about the subway. And the kids had no idea. They thought it was like the sandwich store. A kid that grows up in a town in Montana in the 90s with 400 people in the entire town has never heard of a subway. And so now you can see they're going to get that item wrong. And it's a good example of like a cultural difference that would make you not do well on those tests. And if you're talking about basic knowledge that you learn in school and a lot of those kinds of things, that could vary, but they can also be what we call culturally biased. There's no test that's said to be completely culture free. Some try to get close to there with like symbols and pictures and things like that, but there's no one test that's said to be completely culture free. So there's the context of your results that need to be taken into account. And that's what we're really doing in that feedback session. It's not just giving you your numbers, but what do they mean for you? What do they mean in the context of your background, cultural background, learning background, your functional background, all that kind of stuff. And if you're having one of those tests, and it takes a long time to do all that kind of testing, in addition to other things for autism, for example, if you're going to get what we call a full battery, because it garners a ton of information. And a licensed psychologist is going to look at that information in a way that is sensitive to all those things that I'm talking about. Like they're going to know about biases that could affect that, for example, right? You could have someone that does not so well on the verbal side, but just knocks it out of the park on the performance side, which is not typical, like normed. People usually are about even on each. And there's even like a scale of how far apart they have to be to have it be clinically significant or statistically significant. And I've had a lot of clients like that are really, really good at the performance stuff, but the book learning and that kind of thing that you tend to get like K through 12, not as great at. Doesn't mean they're not smart or intelligent. It means we're looking at what that version of that test, how that test defines intelligence, right? And then there's other tests that test intelligence. There's the Stanford Binet is one. There's ones that try to look at constructs of cognition that are pure memory tests, like the Ray complex figure. If you have to do these, you have to copy these figures and then see if you can remember parts of it, not too long away and then further away. So we have a whole bevy of tests that we can choose from to figure out and to try to get an idea of kind of what's going on in there. But intelligence, I just want to kind of demystify for the audience. When someone says, oh, what's your IQ score? I never want to tell them, and B, I kind of go through the spiel because it's a bit of a meaningless number overall, unless it's a super high number, and then you know someone did really well on everything. And that could just mean they're really good at book learning and that kind of stuff. You know, traditionally, like American presidents have been high, except for the most recent one. And people would, I'm just going to bash Trump a little bit here because I'm just going to get political. People would ask me, oh, but don't you think Trump is smart? I mean, look, he's like manipulating. And for me, the vocabulary is the clue that he's not. He does not have a broad range of vocabulary. He uses the same words. He kind of repeats them. He doesn't understand a full context of words. He misuses words and those kinds of things. And that's usually a really good indicator, especially for someone who supposedly had an Ivy League education, that he's not very bright, right? But it would be really interesting to test him. and see what's in there, because I'm making assumptions just based on these observations. And obviously I'm biased, and those could come out looking totally different than what my guess would be, which is also the beauty of doing the testing. I've been surprised lots of times when I've tested people and I'm like, wow, that's not what I expected. So it really does try to get in there and see what's going on in terms of, like you said, cognition rather than like intelligence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're working with too is this idea of who came up with the construct of intelligence.
Yep.
Right. So we start there. We've got all these tests. And I think the thing that I'm struck with, especially as I do more and more and more work with the neurodiverse community, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do I see? I realize, and I've also learned this from my neuropsych colleagues, the brain isn't just in a jar on top of your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is connected to a sensory motor system.
That's
So what if your hearing, we know there are sensory sensitivities and differences in autistics. We know this.
Yeah.
So what if my visual processing, is off in some way, shape, or form, and I can't necessarily make out the words? If I can't read that and I give you a very low score, does that mean that I don't have a high IQ? No, it means that I have a visual processing problem. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. That's right.
And so, as much as we've got different assessments, right? We've got the Wechsler set, which is kind of the gold standard set, which, by the way, is not allowed to be able to use in public schools because of its torrid history.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you're not allowed to use the whisk in elementary or because it's culturally biased. So they don't allow you. So the KTEA is usually what districts use.
Okay.
And then we've got our Stanford Binet, which is really sensitive at the tails, meaning very, very gifted, and individuals that will struggle with doing certain things. This is the way that intelligence is, measured. Right. We've got the C-Tony, which is like nonverbal. It's a language free, as much motor free test, right? But then people will be like, I don't accept a nonverbal IQ. It's like, why? Yeah. Why don't you? Yeah. So and as an assessor too, we're allowed to test limits. Meaning, there's some things that are timed. Yep. There's ways that you have to actually deliver the administration. But if you're like, I wonder if I gave this person more time. Yeah. I wonder if I gave them one more prompt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, especially if you're testing someone that you think might do well with that little bit of support, like extra
with just more support. And you and I did this before, if I was needing to establish if time would be beneficial for a collegiate student, let's just say, I would always keep a score of what they looked like at time. Yeah. And then I would test the limits and give them the time and show the difference in the scores.
Yeah.
And so I would do that just because I think that that's a responsible thing to do clinically, especially if I'm, the purpose of that is to really see what a student can do with more time.
With more time,
can do with more context, right?
Yeah.
But, I can inflate or deflate someone's IQ that way.
Oh, yeah.
So how valid is this? And I think for me, we just don't pay enough attention to the sensory motor systems in the way in which we think about how someone is able to perform. I mean, think about, if you're under constant stress and sensory bombardment, should we test your IQ?
Yeah. And you have to do it kind of like in one setting, and it's a long time and people get fatigued. And I had a person that I work with in my internship who had cerebral palsy. And I don't know who in their right mind gave this poor guy a waist, because you have to move blocks around and stuff like that. And he obviously came out looking, what the word they used then was mentally retarded, which is a horrible label. And he thought he was, and I sat and talked with him, and I could just tell by the discussions we had, he was way smarter than that. So I explained to him why that would skew that. And I came up with a way to kind of, like you're saying, test the limits. How long would it take him to stack 3 of the blocks that you have in that test? I timed him, and then I went around and did that with a bunch of my classmates. and got an average number for how long it takes someone without a motor problem to stack the 3 blocks, and then for him. And then we figured out a ratio to adjust all the scores. Now, yes, we didn't give the test standardized, and it wouldn't be something that would like hold up in court or whatever. But he came out way higher,
Of course.
and actually was in the more superior range for intelligence. And we were able to talk to him about that as sort of a therapeutic tool for him. Now, the bugger was he was getting Social Security because he couldn't work for obvious reasons. So he had to have these low scores to still get SSI. So that happens a lot too. But it was so, he was so dejected and felt his self-worth was so low because he'd been labeled not smart with one of these tests. And it took someone like me to say, wait a minute, that test wasn't used properly, and that's terrible. But then we also talked about leaving it in his file so he could continue to get Social Security, because that's a whole other system that isn't fair either. It sort of reminds me of what you're talking about. How can I figure out for this kid to do better in school? Extra time, quiet room, me not sitting there staring at them while they're doing it, whatever it would take. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And this, you bring up a systemic issue, right? That we've covered actually on the show quite a bit, which is this idea of not disabled enough, or those tweeners that are kind of like in the middle. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, I have to deflate something in order to, and it's ridiculous. Or this idea, I think in our learning system right now, it is, we got to wait till you fail until we approve or see that you need something. And I think that a lot in behavior, where it's like, if you have no outward behavior that is, I'll say maladaptive. I know a lot of people don't like that word, but it is maladaptive.
Doesn't fit that system. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That doesn't mean, just because there's an absence of that behavior doesn't mean that person isn't struggling internally.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I think that's really tough, because then now we're only looking at externalized behaviors, no internalized behavior at all. And so for me, it's really interesting, because a lot of, if you're a good masker, and we've talked about masking a lot on the show, a lot of people don't realize that you are a functioning depressed person. Like, I don't know.
Well, I was thinking with the intelligence test, with the cognitive test specifically, I got pegged as a kid as being impulsive a lot. And it was frustration. We've talked about that before. But like a lot of the non-timed tests, or the time tests that are like puzzles or things you have to solve, I would get flustered. And then now my ability to focus on it is going to go out the window. And as I've gotten older, as you mature, I'm like, I'm going to give myself permission to take my time. I'm going to give myself permission to relax and really, instead of just giving up immediately, I'm going to stick with it. Because before it was like, I couldn't do it immediately. I'm stupid. Why try it all? That has nothing to do with the intelligence. That has to do with that kind of like you're talking about. It's something else besides intelligence, that if you didn't pick up on that, you didn't know that, right? And that's that other thing you can ask about outside the test itself, is a little bit of what we call protocol analysis. And that's, after you do that, ask the person what was going through your head as you were doing that test. And oftentimes that's the nugget for me, where they'll say something like, well, I figured I didn't know the answer right away, so I'm stupid, so I'm not going to try. So, that's really important to know. I mean, especially therapeutically, and maybe even accommodation wise, versus you're dumb because you don't know the answer to this. Right.
Right.
And that's not something you would do in typical administration, but you could learn so much from that.
Well, and I really feel like that truly is, in my mind, where the clinician's expertise is necessary. Yeah. Because, why do an evaluation in the first place? I mean, the reality is we're doing evaluations for a certain reason. We shouldn't just be like, hey, you want to know your IQ? Come on in. Like, that's not why we do that. We do it because we're facing something. I feel like it's a way to sleuth the way the brain is working, right?
Right,
And,
right.
Dana was saying earlier, like Dana, you were talking about verbal and your verbal, this kind of VIQ, verbal IQ, verbal reasoning, perceptual reasoning, nonverbal reasoning. But we also have, in that test, we've got speed and working memory. And this idea of speed, which is how quickly can I do things that I know, right? That I've mastered. And this idea of working memory, which is how many things can my brain juggle at one time?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, if you have any attentional problems,
it's gonna,
your working memory is going to look really, really poor.
Yeah. And if
usually,
you're anxious, that's really hits working memory hard.
Yeah, you're gonna right. That's right. And so, what's the reason, for that? And I really think that's where clinicians need to actually test limits, and they need to explore what is happening for somebody, because in that example that you gave, we didn't test that the result of that isn't that person isn't smart. The result of that is that based on his cumulative lived experiences, his messaging is that I'm why is learned helplessness. Basically, that's what we learned from
on that test, he earns those scores for that test. That's all those numbers mean, is that person earned those scores on that test. We can't really say that person is intelligent or not. And that's the other thing we learn when we're doing that testing is you're testing the constructs that this test says you're testing, which is something like, how fast can they think on the fly, especially if they're anxious. And, so instead of just saying, they can't do it when they're under pressure, versus that maybe this is an area for them that they need some support or not be under pressure. Yeah.
Right. Or they really need more time to understand and collect themselves and think about a problem, and that pressure. So we see this a lot, that timed things can suppress people's performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes them nervous and anxious, and then, based on their history too. But I mean, I think for us, what is our channel about? Our channel is about understanding, being seen in a safe place, and being understood. Right.
Yeah. Right.
And that IQ and intelligence is really such an interesting construct today. And for us, it's really about, I think, how do you think you're best? Like at your best.
Yeah.
What are the conditions for that for you particularly? And those are the conditions you want to put yourself in most of the time.
Yeah. And it reminds me, as you're saying that, so we're talking about cognitive and IQ, and this is different than aptitude. So I'm thinking a lot of the tests that I had, like you get in grade school and junior high, are aptitude tests. What that's telling you is where your interest areas lie, first of all, and B, what you might be good at, right? So that might be something like, I always got, you'd be good at social sciences, and I wanted to be a veterinarian. And of course, they ended up being right all those years ago. But it can also, I'm thinking too of like, I love when I have to have, not that I love spending money on those things, but when I have to have someone come to my house to fix something that's beyond what I'm able to do. But I always marvel at like electricians.
I know.
I'm like, how do you understand this stuff? And they're like, blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. And that is an aptitude, right? So that is, yes, that person's trained in that, but clearly that person understood those kinds of things really well to begin with. And then they gravitate towards it because they have an aptitude for it, right?
Yep.
So when I tell people, I did really well in grad school, and they say, that's great because grad school is so hard. And it was, that's for sure. But I also feel like I had a little bit of a leg up because it was such a strong aptitude of mine. It wasn't hard to understand the concepts. There was a lot of work to get those things done, but the concepts were like, that makes sense. If you had me put in an electrical panel, I would not have any idea what to do. So that's a difference between aptitude and intelligence, right?
Right. And achievement. So the other word is achievement here, which is achievement is usually a result of what you've been exposed to and have practiced at. And we usually see those things like reading and math and what and that IQ test or, are looking at, and that's why they're biased, because the verbal section of those tests are asking you about these general facts that you should have been exposed to in good quality
But
education.
what if you weren't? Right. Yeah.
But what if you weren't, right?
Yep.
Because, but you know what's so interesting, Dana, as you talk about aptitude, because I'm spatially like I have a deficit in spatial awareness. I swear I do.
Uh-huh.
And so, classically, in undergrad and grad school, you test college students
Mhm.
in psych experiments.
Right.
This is the normal.
They're the lab
And
rats.
right. And I
Yeah.
did a rotation. I worked as a research assistant for a cognitive psychologist.
Oh, uh-huh.
And we had to take the test. And this was like 30 years ago. There was an image, and then the question was, what would this image look like if you turned it 180 degrees
Oh
or you turned
God.
it
Yeah.
90 degrees?
Yeah.
I could not. And to this day, it's like, well, about how many square feet is that, Gwen? I don't know.
Yeah. And then
What does
that's
that
a
even
really good
mean?
example. My wife's the same way. She cannot do that. I,
No.
for some strange reason, can do it, but I have to get my body involved. I have to, because I'll do this like when I'm doing a screw, I'm like righty tighty, and then I have to like go down to where it would be, and then I
Yeah.
can see it. I can't
Right.
just do it in my head. I have to get my body involved. And so
Right.
there's clearly some other system that I'm using versus people that can do it all in their head. And
Right.
that's just
Right.
different brain wiring. There's nothing you can do
That's
to
right.
train that, to get over it, whatever that is. And
That's
so
right.
various certain things are going to select for that. Like if you're an astronaut, you need to have that capacity. So you and I could
Or an
never be
engineer.
astronauts. Or an engineer.
Right. Or an
Yeah,
engineer.
Or an architect.
Or
yeah.
right.
Yep.
Like that's
Yep.
just not gonna be like, that's just not as a good friend of ours say, like, that's not my ministry. That's just not,
there
that's
you
not
go. You
mine.
would design one of those buildings that has like the stairs to nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think in this conversation, it's like, don't let, oh my gosh, I feel like this is a conspiracy theory, but like, don't let the bigger establishment tell you if you're smart or not. Really, right?
Yeah.
Like really think about what you're good at, what comes easy for you, what you naturally can do.
Like.
Right.
What twirls you.
Right.
You were talking about aptitude. We recently, where I teach, we have stopped requiring the GRE for admission.
Yeah.
Because it just tests people that are good at standardized tests with that general information. What's a better indicator for us is how they did in 4 years of undergrad.
Yes.
Than a 3-hour test under the gun, right? And that's sort of along those same lines too. Yeah.
Yes. I'm really happy about this test blindness. We're moving away from SATs. We're moving away. And what I really love about that, one, I'm like when I took the SATs and I got my results back, I was like, well, I'm not taking these again because if I do, I will prove that I'm dumb. Like
just prove that test, you didn't do well on that test.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I'm a terrible standardized test taker.
I did the ACT and the GRE and did terrible on both.
I know. I mean, the GRE I studied for a long time, and what did I get from the GRE? The word pedantic, and I don't know, like whatever. Right? It was like so stupid. But I'm really happy about this because all it does, I think, is, and there is a piece of this, which is it does separate people that are, one, just kind of naturally good standardized test takers. But the other is it also does separate the people who got a lot of like standardized test coaching. Right.
Or had money to do that. Or like you said, went to an affluent school and had different learning environment. And it's very culturally oppressive. Yeah.
And so my daughter is in high school, and something that they're really helping them understand is what colleges want to see now is something similar to what you said, Dana, which is we want to see that you grew every year. You did something more in your sophomore year. You did something different and more in your junior. And you did so you added new experiences. You did additional things. That's actually what they're looking at now. It's not, and I'm so happy for that. Like from just my own bias, because I just don't think, I think What do we want? We want people who stay in it and are engaged
Mhm.
and are curious and
Yeah.
want to do good for people. Like these are the
Yeah, what are
pieces
things
of,
you tried? What did you like? What didn't you like? And that
yeah.
yeah, 'cause that's what you should be doing. Yeah.
College students with some self-awareness and really nice emotional management skills, like
Yeah.
get out of
Yep.
town, right?
I know.
That's where we're going to really have some thriving happening
Right.
instead of the highest rate of college students returning back home. The highest rate ever in our history.
Really?
Yep,
Wow.
college failure and coming back home right now.
And do you think that's because of all the changes and everything, and they just can't it's not the material so much as it is
The
maybe
social
it's that
emotional realm.
there's such a big chasm now between the old guard who's still teaching at universities
Yeah,
and
maybe.
how younger people learn, right?
Yeah.
Because I'll have
Yeah.
my students say, "I really like classes with you because we can challenge you and you don't, like, get mad at us." And I'm like, "I want you to challenge me." They're
That's
like,
what
"Well,
college is
not
about.
all the professors feel that way." They're like, "Hey, I'm the expert and you better shut up." And I'm thinking, does that happen at universities too, where students are like, these lecture hall with 300 students and you take a test and you don't do well, and then what? Right? That's one of the main reasons I dropped out initially when I first went off to school.
Yeah.
I was in a chemistry class of 300 people. I had no idea what was going on, what
That's
was happening, and
crazy.
it's crazy.
300 people. That's
Yeah,
nuts, Dana.
yeah, yeah,
Nuts.
yeah.
Nuts.
That and everything else that, in hindsight
Yeah.
made sense. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
highest rate returning home. Wow.
Yeah, we've got a lot of failure to thrive at the collegiate levels
Mhm,
right now.
mhm.
Or kids actually graduating college and not being able to go, like not kind of launching into their life, so coming back home.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that makes sense, yeah. That's
So
just
there's
because
a
they
lot of
can't
that as
afford
well.
anything since everything's so expensive. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
no joke. All right,
yeah.
Marvels. Well, if you have any thoughts about intelligence or cognition, we haven't even gotten into the other things like emotional intelligence. There's lots of different kinds of
Mhm,
intelligence out there. I mean,
mhm.
Howard Gardner, am I getting his name right? Dana?
Is that
Isn't
who
that
did the
isn't the
EQ? Is
multiple
that
intelligence guy? That's the
I think
multiple
so.
intelligence guy.
Yeah, I think
Anyway,
so.
gosh, so I guess that's another thing that came out of the GRE. No, just kidding. It's not. It came out of the GRE. But what are your thoughts about intelligence and what that means in today's
Yeah.
world? We'd love to
Or what
see
has
it.
been your experience getting assessed? Because I hear a
Yeah.
lot of horror stories. Yeah,
Yeah. Isn't that
yeah,
true? Isn't that true?
yeah.
Thanks, Marvels. We will see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye.